Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to the Heartbeat. Today we're going to be talking about episode 5 of season 1 of HBO's The Night Of. Join me, will you? So, if you guys have followed The Heartbeat for any length of time, I'm sure you've come to realize, even if just a little bit, how much I love psychoanalysis and kind of how I view film and television as just this great arena for that. And this week's episode of The Night Of really was as beautifully complex of an arena as ever. And perhaps even more so, in a lot of ways, almost feeling like it was forcing us to project our own fears and assumptions onto the lead characters, ultimately inviting us to self-reflect and self-assess. So, to compare us to a couple of the characters from this week's episode, we really were asked to be a bit like the mortician and prosecuting attorney Helen Wise, as they encountered pieces of information that needed to very quickly be extrapolated upon, each instance being more about projecting their own experiences and worldviews than analyzing the cold, hard facts. And for the mortician, as Miss Wise asked him whether or not the cut on Naz's hand could have been sustained from his knife slipping when he struck a bone in Andrea's body while stabbing her to death, even as it didn't necessarily seem like the attorney was asking some kind of leading question or in some way was disinterested in the actual truth, the mortician really couldn't have cared less, having his entire life been in and out of courtrooms and day in and day out handled what we would all one day become, that being lifeless, cold, naked, drained of everything pieces of meat. He had adopted a rather nihilistic, what's the point worldview. And because of that, the conclusion that he projected onto that picture really was one that would just enable his existence to continue to be as easy and as hassle-free as possible. And as a side note, the theme of mortality really did run through this entire episode a fair amount, not only seen obviously in the morgue, but also seen in the character of Trevor. He really did resist ratting out Duane Reade as long as possible because he feared death. And it really was no random thought at all when he mentioned to John Stone that next month his great-grandmother would be 102, because that was an age that he feared he would never get close to experiencing himself. And the other character that I kind of just had to identify with, even just a little bit, as she projected onto nothing, something that she wanted to see, was Prosecutor Wise. When she, in that security footage, saw a parked taxi spitting out male passengers but accepting female fares, what she perceived was a driver, cold and calculated, premeditating a murder. Not because the images themselves spelt that out, but because she had spent her life putting away other murderers who shared enough in common with Naz for her to project their guilt onto him. And this week, the character that uncovered that security footage actually ended up being one of the individuals whose actions and motivations were just a little more unclear, forcing us as an audience to project our worldviews and our thoughts onto them. And for me, what kept Detective Box's very nebulous actions from becoming boring or frustrating was I didn't project onto them dispassion or disconnection. What I saw were quiet, dutiful actions carried out by a man whose work was often thankless and unimpressive, but carried out faithfully nonetheless. And I do still believe that Box will continue to grow in his investment and engagement in this case, eventually discovering that Naz was wrongly convicted, but discovering it too late, being forced once again to face the brokenness of the system that he'd fought so long to uphold. And you could just see the rumblings of that as he stood there listening to Helen Wise so hurriedly conclude that Naz must have planned Andrea's murder. But even as we knew that that's not why Naz was parked there, because we had been there in that moment with him, things did become significantly less clear this week when some new information was made known that we didn't experience with our hero, that being his taking of Adderall before going out that night. And for us, the viewer, it did so much more than simply remove the good boy card from our board. It removed from our minds the assumption that we knew everything about this character. Yes, we had gone through a lot together, but not everything together. Which made Naz 2 just more of that blank slate on which we could project our own assumptions, hopes, and fears. And this episode, none of that was more pronounced than in the moment where Naz just came unhinged and beat Calvin in that shower. What a huge moment for that character. Because yes, Naz was a smart kid and had realized that doing things like push-ups, shaving his head, and just adopting an all-around tougher demeanor would improve his chances of survival in prison. But that's not what I saw in that moment. What I saw was something come out of Naz, something that had been there long before he walked into that prison. Just an anger and a rage over all of the injustice that he'd endured his entire life. It wasn't just that Calvin had thrown burning oil on or derogatory terms at our hero, it was that he, by telling Nas just to walk away, suddenly became everyone. Everyone who, as Nas had put it back in the first episode while talking to Andrea, had always told him what to do. And he was done doing whatever they said. And in that moment, I did genuinely think for the first time, maybe Nas did do it. Maybe Andrea had pushed him in his intoxicated state, preying upon his lowered inhibitions, drawing out that same kind of rage. Maybe. I still do have my significant doubts that Nas was the murderer. And even as Nas's actions were a little more difficult to interpret this week, the writers and director did do a great job of helping to clue us in as to what was happening in his mind in a couple of scenes, especially with some rather brilliant editing. One occurred right after Detective Box found the place along the river where Nas had taken Andrea, because even though that scene seemed to conclude as we cut to Nas sleeping in bed, the editor actually quite quickly cut back to that bridge, seeming to imply that that was where Nas's mind and heart remained, really the only place we'd seen him this entire series that he'd come close to being happy, before everything went to hell, and he actually believed that maybe, just maybe, he was making a genuine connection with this mysterious girl. And the other moment that gave us a similar peek into Nas's psyche came when the cheery drugstore music started before we cut visually to that location, really making it feel like that was the kind of carefree feeling that filled Nas in that moment. Ironically, that exact same music track was actually just an unpleasant reminder to John Stone of the kind of place that he couldn't seem to escape. Though, if we look at the way the episode ended and the editing choices that were made there, we will find that Stone and Nas are still connected, the former's psyche being revealed in a very similar fashion to what I just described with Nas. This week we saw that Stone was ready to step in and try, ready to invite Chandra into his house and expose the lengths that he went to cure his eczema, ready to take in that cat and endure that allergic reaction, ready to go to his son's school and connect with those students, ready to take that Viagra and sleep with that call girl, ready in that very moving scene to tell Nas, hey, look, I know why you're sneaking in these drugs, but if you get caught, I can't help you. Ready to chase down Dwayne Reed and uncover the truth, who, for my money, either didn't kill Andrea or did, but won't be caught. But despite all of those newfound desires, where did we find Stone at the end of this episode? Alone. And they really reinforced that feeling by cutting the flashes of that UV light under which Stone at the top of the episode had sat, all alone, struggling futilely to resolve his problems. Going forwards, I am hoping for just a little bit more from Detective Box. He was one of my very favorite characters from episodes 1 and 2, and just hasn't done a whole lot since then to just blow my socks off. But again, like I mentioned earlier, I am hopeful that he'll continue to invest and engage more and more in this case, and that will make his character all the more interesting. Also, I wanted to give a shout out to one of my excellent subscribers and commenters. You last week did mention that Chandra probably has some ulterior motives, and I think that was very much revealed this week when Stone asked her about the Khan's lawyer fees, and she kind of just said very callously, they'll get the money, they'll beg, they'll steal, they'll borrow, whatever. It kind of just revealed a callousness in her that I didn't see necessarily before, so kudos on you for calling that out. Also, to the rest of you guys, I asked you last week to engage with me just a little bit more, clicking the thumbs up all the more, commenting all the more, sharing all the more, and you guys answered in spades, so sincerely, thank you so much. It means a lot, and it really is helping this channel to grow for all of us, and that's super, super exciting as I move towards making this the full-time thing. Anyhow, those are my thoughts on this week's episode. Please comment below and let me know what you thought of the episode. Also, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.